Welcome back to The Fix with me, Karima Brown. And now it's time for the week ahead. Welcome to my panel, Professor Ivor Chipkin. He is, of course, from Parry and co-author of The Shadow State, which we will be discussing. Also, a very big welcome to a senior journalist and specialist at TISO Blackstar, Karen Morn, and, of course, my trusted partner, Peter Bruce, columnist at the Sunday Times. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so very much for joining me. This is, of course, the time where we look at the big stories that are coming up now. Tomorrow, we all know the Zondo Commission's public work starts. Ivor, you have had a lot to do with documenting from an academic point of view what state capture is, whether it is a political project, you know, what's behind it. And in the latest edition, which is kind of an update on the betrayal of the promise, which is The Shadow State, you, as you can see by my notes, I've gone through it like a crazy person. It outlines very clearly some of the issues that are at stake. But I want us to first listen to the former Deputy Finance Minister, Mcebisi Jonas, speak about state capture and the fact that it predates, of course, Gupta-led capture as we understand it today.
It's wrong to think that state capture happened in the last 10 years. It predates that, actually. And think very seriously, I think in the research that we've been doing, if you remember that when did the Guptas arrive in this country, who assisted them, for what purpose? Clearly, it was not in the last 10 years. It goes beyond that. I think people must actually embed it. The last 10 years was probably a point where doors were opened too wide for state capture to deepen and happen in a very big way and in a more systematic and structural way. But I don't think we should have walk away here thinking that it's something that happened in the last 10 years.
Ivor, you obviously agree very much there, and I don't think anyone around this table disagrees. But connect for us what is different about the Gupta-led state capture, because for me that's the essence of what the shadow state is about. You talk about a link up between what you call the constitutional state and the shadow state, and how that happens. And that, of course, is epitomized by the way in which the Guptas went about capturing, you know, South Africa and repurposing key institutions for their private financial gain.
Well, I mean, if we start with Mbisi's point that state capture predates the Guptas by definition. I mean, by definition, the South African state's been captured pretty much since the beginning. This is a state that was built in its foundations from 1910 to serve a tiny white minority. And I think what the promise of 1994 was, finally, we were going to break state capture. We were going to establish a constitutional order that established state institutions that would serve all South Africans, a state that would work in the universal interest in this regard. And I think this is what makes the current period and the Gupta phenomenon, the Zuma period, so particularly shocking, is that that promise looked like it was being betrayed. And I think that is what is different. There was a sense that we were beginning after 1994 to build the apparatuses, the institutions, the processes, the laws, underpinned by the values that would establish a new kind of government, one which we had never had before in South Africa. And I think that is what has been so shocking about the last 10 years.
Peter, you want to come in?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I remember reading, I started reading Shadow State, and then I remembered, I'm sure I've seen this before somewhere.
He's talking about the betrayal of the promise.
I, in fact, read it on my phone. It's on a very difficult app called Scribd or something like that, which is very hard to, But I want to ask you something. So, we were all shocked at the state of state capture, but this is from Umgebulo, which is an ANC publication, 1998. Now, why are we shocked 20 years later that this has happened? This is what it says. Transformation of the state entails, first and foremost, extending the power of the national liberation movement over all levels of power, the army, the police, the bureaucracy, intelligence structures, the judiciary, parastatals and agencies such as regulatory bodies, the public broadcaster, the central bank, and so on. Well, it happened, you know, and they said it was going to happen. It's policy. Why are we shocked?
Because there were at least two fundamentally different tendencies within the ANC. One, I think, was a tendency of a modernizing tendency. It went under the name of non-racialism. It understood that apartheid wasn't simply a system of racial domination. It was also underpinned by massive by capitalism in the particular way in which it functioned. And the idea was to transform and build new kinds of institutions. So there is that politics.
Yeah.
And I think that politics, you see it manifest in, for example, the establishment of SARS, building new kinds of institutions. Even the National Treasury from 2000, incredibly, there are some quite extraordinary moments of successful state institution building.
Yeah.
At the same time, there is this politics of a sense that everything is not about institutions, it's about politics. And we achieve our redress and transformation by deploying the right people to control these institutions. And I think these two tendencies are actually fundamentally different tendencies.
Yeah.
And what we've come to understand now, that they're in contradiction.
But they exist in the same party. And this is the point you make on page 39 of your book. You're saying, what is new about the critique? And you're saying that there's been a critique of ANC policy for a long time, is that increasingly presents South Africa's constitutional settlement as an obstacle to radical constitutional transformers. The former wants to subvert, it says, this has led to a clash between radical reformers and what you call constitutional transformers. The former wants to subvert and bypass constitutionally entrenched institutions to manage rents on behalf of a power elite, while the latter seeks to build state capacity to deliver on that promise of equality and development. Now, Karen, let me bring you in here. One of the institutions that have been totally, in fact, hollowed out is, of course, the National Prosecuting Authority. We saw in the past week the President making an acting announcement. We also saw a very serious case going to court. What is concerning for me is that Mr. Silas Ramaite is, in fact, someone who comes with a blemished record. He has been arrested for drunken driving. The case magically went away. There's apparently other really nasty stuff that are being said about him, you know, in the corridors of power. But more importantly, Lawrence Mrwebi is in fact the head of investigating corruption. He is one of the two deputies that Freedom Under Law has actually taken to court and said they are not fit to hold purpose. Is the NPO so hollowed out that this attempt to bring the state captures to book is just going to go, you know, nowhere? Is the NPA going to mess up one case after the other?
Well, there's going to be a pretty crucial ruling in the Bloemfontein Magistrates Court on Tuesday, which will actually, in some respect, answer what happens to the first ever state capture prosecution. We've seen lawyers for the Gupta family, the nephew Varun, and people like Nazim Hawa, Ronica Raghavan make a case that essentially says that the state was never ready to actually prosecute them for anything in relation to the so-called Estina Dairy Project scam. Now, the case in that particular prosecution goes to the heart of what you were saying. Essentially, the allegation is that a very wealthy family essentially siphoned off money that was intended for the upliftment of poor black farmers in the Free State area. And instead of being used in a way, I mean, I've read the project notes about how 5 cows would be provided to a person. They would be allowed to, you know, learn how to milk them, sell the milk, potentially uplift their entire family, their whole community. Tragic stories of people selling their own cows, rocking up with, you know, their identity documents, ready to be part of this project, only to be fundamentally and deeply let down. We know about 7 million rand in cows went magically missing. The bodies of cows were found in the water. It was just a horrific story. The state then brings this prosecution where it says that at the heart of this thing, money was being siphoned off into multiple Gupta accounts. They have not failed once, but twice, to go to the court, the High Court, and make a case for asset preservation. In the latest instance, the judge essentially saying that the evidence that they presented wasn't strong enough to suggest that these entities or individuals faced a real prospect of conviction. Now we see them going to court and saying that they are opposing an attempt to postpone this case by 3 to 6 months by the state. They want the matter struck from a roll, and the magistrate will ultimately have to make a determination as to whether he, for at least, you know, until the NPA re-enrolls the matter, puts this particular case out of its misery.
Quickly, before we move on to other issues, if you were a betting person, are they going to lose the case, the NPA?
I will be amazed if they win it. I don't see them winning that case.
Ivor, you're shaking your head.
No, shaking in disbelief. I mean, I think it's shocking.
Because it's so obvious what happened.
They don't, the difficulty was that there was, I remember in one of the rulings that was given, the judge quoted from the Shabir Sheikh matter where he said, money laundering is a sophisticated crime. But then you go to the courts and you present a case which essentially says all this money goes from Estina and it's put straight into Gupta bank accounts. That was never what happened. When we saw the reporting, for instance, on the Gupta wedding, that 30 million, there was a whole sophisticated ring of alleged money laundering through multiple international accounts. That was never the case that they made. Now they're trying to get mutual legal assistance from, the UAE and other countries to make a case of money laundering that they failed to make at the beginning.
Now, this is a point that you make in your book, Professor Chipkin. I mean, you talk about the way in which the Guptas are essentially fixers and money launderers, and how they use fake companies like Homix and others, to transfer money so that you don't really know what the real purpose of the money is. Do you think that our National Prosecuting Authority is deliberately not understanding the phenomena of state capture, or have they just not done enough police work to find this information? Because you found it, you have been able to document it here. You spoke to people in secret. You spoke to many of the people that were bullied, that were strong-armed into doing this. How can the police not find these people?
You know what I'm starting to understand is that many of the instruments they used were unbelievably complex. And I'm not certain that our investigators, and including within the NPA, have had the expertise to unravel the complexity of these financial instruments that they used. So this idea of just transferring a whole bunch of money into accounts, we even picked up that they were shifting money through 18 companies, in and out, and then money moving to Dubai and into Hong Kong, and then coming back into these complex variations. But we're beginning to understand that those mechanisms and those facilities are way much more complicated than that. And I think it requires a financial sophistication to be able to unravel these things, which I'm not sure we have at the moment.
What is interesting is reading the MSN forensic report now into Transnet, is that they are basically breaking it down for the police almost, it seems, saying, listen, here's the problem, this is what's wrong, this is what the crime is called, this is what it contravenes, and this is what you got to charge him with. And that just row after row after row of these things, the charges, just flying out of every page.
But here's the question, lady and gentlemen. Tomorrow we have the Zondo Commission of Inquiry. We have some fantastic forensic investigators that are there. Let me start with you, Karen. Do you think those forensic investigators will be able to do a better job at making those links, connecting the famous dots that Pravin Gordhan is always talking about?
Well, I think it's heartening that obviously Terence Nombembe is involved, because he has quite definitive experience in terms of that in his previous role. But I think what the professor is alluding to is something that is, and you as well, is this has become endemic in all state institutions. There's literally been an almost complete outsourcing of forensic investigations to private institutions, whether it's Vaxman's, notoriously now KPMG. All these firms are making huge amounts of money because there is such a profound deficit in terms of proper forensic investigation within the state. But I think there is, one of the issues, and we write about this in one of the TESOL publications tomorrow, is that we've actually got the DCJ on record saying that one of their biggest difficulties, which is causing completely unacceptable delays, according to his office, is that the SSA is not providing the requisite security clearance for investigators.
Yeah.
Now, Peter, one of the things that you and I have discussed is, of course, the fact that a lot of people are intimidated and they are having to give evidence in front of the Zondo Commission. Do you think people are going to shy away from coming to this
I hope
commission?
not, I hope people like Themba Maseko, who first came out and spoke out and said what Zuma had asked him to do for the Guptas, and how he had refused and what had happened to him and how the Guptas threatened him. He's got to go there and tell that story to Joe Zondo.
We have to, of course, wrap this session. It's a very big pity. There's lots more to discuss, but we'll all be watching the Zondo Commission. Still ahead on the facts and the cool stuff.